So I want to talk first really quick about this one, a really cool quote by Ralph Nichols. It says, "The most basic of all human needs is the need to understand and to be understood. And the best way to understand people is to listen to them." Everyone have pens, by the way? Liz, did you figure it out? In the
We kind of have little pens.
So I want to talk real quick, kind of overview of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to cover 5 main points. First is like how rare it is for people actually to listen. Then why it is important to listen, as well as how you know you're listening well, and how can you tell someone or show someone that you're listening well. And then lastly, the impact that listening can have. But first off, I want to talk a little bit about the exercise we did.
Cool.
Well, yeah, we'll kind of cover some of those topics later with like what body language and what signals you were sending. But really, listening is hard. It's one of the hardest arts to learn and one of the most difficult to ever master. And there's actually this interesting saying that you actually have two ears and one mouth. So why is it so hard to listen? But really it's because we don't necessarily learn how to listen. I mean, if you think about it, where would you learn how to listen? We have communication classes, but what do they teach? They teach you how to talk to people, how to speak in front of people, how to keep business conversations, right? But have you ever had something that taught you like how to listen? Unless you're a psych major, counseling major, you might have some classes on that. But we're never really taught how to listen. It's just something you have to pick up, right? But why is it so difficult? There's actually a couple points on why it's so hard, and this is in your little handout. First is preconceived notions. So this is the idea of like you already have predetermined thoughts. Not necessarily that you're a know-it-all, but it's just kind of like when someone's talking to you and they're saying something that you're interested in, you want to tell them what you feel about it or what you think about it. And you're trying to put in your 2 cents, right? I don't know if any of you are guilty of this in conversations, but you know, if someone starts talking about something you're interested in, you're like, ooh, let me tell you about that. And you want to talk. So you kind of have this preconceived notions of what you want to say, and you kind of bring the conversation back at you. Kind of you heard it all before. And here's a interesting study by Exec Prov. It's a communication training company. But they said one of the reasons for difficulty listening is because there's too much stimulation around us. There's so much going on that it's difficult for us to focus on what people are saying. So that's essentially our next part, which is the distractions and technology. I don't know if anyone else is guilty of checking their phone in a conversation, but I am. I know phones go off, text messages, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, whatever it is. We were kind of talking about body language earlier, how like when someone would stop listening to you, they kind of like turned away or they weren't making eye contact. And what clearer form of body language than to like pick up your phone, like look at it, and like start texting when you're talking to someone over here. So it's kind of the ways to show that you aren't listening, or maybe you're not listening as well. And kind of one thing I wanted to talk about in the beginning, with all these things I talk about with things that are like showing you're not listening, it's not necessarily that they're bad, but it's like if you want to show that you're listening, try to stay away from them. But yeah, the third thing is that we're in a hurry, which is basically, I feel like our society has this huge kind of illusion of busyness where you have to constantly be doing something. I don't know if any of you guys have recently sat down and done nothing or just kind of relaxed, but I know when I'm ever in like a road trip or something and I'm not driving and there's no like music, I don't have an iPod, I'm not texting someone, I feel really strange and uncomfortable because I'm like, shouldn't I be doing some homework or reading a book for class or something? You know, because we have this illusion that we're like always supposed to be busy or working. I don't know if you guys have noticed how that carries over into conversations to where you're thinking about something else, thinking about what's next, what am I going to say next? Or like, what's my next class? What homework do I have? You're kind of filling your brains with thoughts instead of focusing on what they're saying. I don't know if you guys ever heard the different studies on like multitasking, but most people say it's impossible. I would say in certain scenarios it may be possible to multitask, but I think it's pretty safe to say that whenever you multitask, you're not giving 100% to either thing. So if you think about conversation, if you're trying to multitask during conversation, you're clearly not giving the other person 100%. So sometimes that can communicate. And they can feel like, oh, this person doesn't necessarily care completely about me. Now, I don't know who talks on the phone a lot, like calls their mom, calls their friends, whatever. Now, Liz, do you want to talk about if on the phone, like, have you ever tried multitasking while you're calling someone? Like cooking or something like that?
I'm on my computer doing some work. My mom will say something, I'll be like, yeah, and she goes, you weren't listening to her, and I go, no. Because she's always sitting there actually listening to me.
Yeah.
It's embarrassing.
So sometimes when I'm on the phone with someone, I'm trying to multitask, I'll just have to say like, okay, hold on, I gotta stop what I'm doing and just listen to what you're saying. Because I'll realize that I keep missing what they said over and over and over again, and I'm just like, wow, I feel like a terrible friend. So especially in conversation, kind of limiting those distractions and that kind of feeling of having to be doing something helps. And the last thing is self-importance. So this is natural, guys. Don't feel super guilty if you struggle with this, but this is just kind of the way that you are. This is like, it's hard to listen because we naturally care about ourselves. We want to talk about ourselves. We want to share stories about how I did something, how I did something else. Liz said something funny in the last meeting. She talked about one-upping someone in a conversation. I don't know if you've ever done that, but it's basically like they'll share a story, but you got to one-up it. Right? Like, oh, you did this? Well, I did that. And you're like, oh, like what does that do for the conversation? And it just made them feel bad. But it's natural, right? We want to do that. We want to be like, hey, we kind of get like this feeling of status, like, oh, yes, I did something good too. Stephen Covey said, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. So while you're sitting there listening, you're thinking about, what can I say next? How can I come back to this? What can I add? And I think the interesting thing is when you learn how to like start conversations with people, obviously it's different like starting with someone brand new that you're just meeting, but kind of one thing that you're taught is to relate to them, right? And one way that we relate is we try to come up with things that are similar. So I don't know if you ever tried this, but sometimes someone will be like, oh, I'm from this place. I'll try to come up with some like, oh, my second cousin's niece lives there. Like, yeah, I know about that place. And sometimes I'll like come up with something. I don't even know what they said, really. I'm just like trying to come up with some sort of thing to relate it. But really it's just bringing it back to me in a sense too. So although that may be helpful for like the first impression or just meeting someone, trying to find something that relates with them, when you're having a good conversation with a friend and you keep bringing it back to you, it doesn't necessarily show that you're listening to them. So to summarize, one of the cool statistics I found was the fact that we are capable of talking like kind of the average maximum. Obviously there's some people who have like world records in this, but you're typically only capable of speaking at 125 words per minute, but your brain can comprehend 400 words per minute. So there's a 275 word per minute gap that, has extra brain computing capacity that you have in there. So why is it so hard to listen to a normal conversation? It's because, like I said, we fill our mind with all these other things, with the busyness, with the distractions, with ourselves and what we're going to say as a reply. And that's kind of how we fill that space. But really, when you think about it, if you're really trying to comprehend what they're saying, sometimes that takes a lot of thinking, right? Because it's not just the words. They're speaking with their body language. They're speaking with their tone of voice. And if you were just listening to someone, you might not get the whole picture of what they're trying to communicate. So you're trying to take all that in and process, okay, what are they really trying to say to me? So that's kind of how we can be using that rest of our mind. So this is an interesting quote. It says, listening is such a simple act, it requires us to be present. And although it does take practice, we don't need to have to do anything else. We don't need to have advice or coach or be wise. We just have to be willing to sit there and listen. It's interesting how simple listening is, but we overcomplicate it. We feel like we need to give advice. Someone really just needs to be heard. So what makes someone good at listening? Here's another quote. Effective listeners remember that words have no meaning. People have meaning. The assignment of meaning to a term is an internal process, and meaning comes from inside us. And although our experience, knowledge, and attitudes differ, we often misinterpret each other's messages while under the illusion that a common understanding has been achieved. Now, that's a really detailed quote, and it's kind of hard to get after one reading or one listening, but it's the fact that oftentimes we're in a conversation and we both think we understand each other, but really we're on completely different levels. They're talking about one thing, and you're like completely somewhere else, and you think you understand each other, but that's just because of the words that are being exchanged. You don't really know what's being communicated. It's kind of like when you're texting someone, and sometimes you send a text, and they get all mad at you, and you're like, wait a second, like, what did I say? Because they totally like assigned meaning to those words that you put down that you didn't intend. Same thing happens in conversation, especially when we're distracted and we're not trying to understand what they're saying. So do this real quick. This is a part on your little handout. Basically, think of 3 people who are really, really good listeners that you know. Whoever you like to talk to, like to share stuff with, just really good listeners. Cool. Now, how many of you guys put down somebody that you don't like? Nobody? Now, do you guys respect those people? Maybe? So I think it's safe to conclude that people that are good listeners, we typically like and respect. Cool. So yeah, basically, the next step would be like, how do we show someone that we're a good listener? Because if we want to be liked and respected, we have to have someone to pick up on the fact that we're a good listener. Basically, there's 4 main things. Body language. We talked about this earlier. What are some examples of body language to show someone that you're listening to them? You know? Eye contact? Perfect. Daniel? Facing them. We call this like open posture.
Yeah.
This is like closed, but this is open. And sometimes it even makes a difference, like in group situations. Like when I start talking to someone specific, even if I'm in front, it feels different. Like I'm listening and communicating with one person. So body language is very powerful. What's something else? Posture? That's like listening to someone, right? You're engaged, you're listening, you're excited.
People that slouch tend to not listen as much. You know,
True.
like you wanna you feel like someone's listening to you better when they're like upright and like actually like focusing on the conversation.
Sometimes people just like sit back, put their feet up, and like don't really care what you're saying. Cool.
Kind of going off of what you were saying about like closing off. Like,
Yeah. definitely. So that's kind of like what I was saying earlier, like listening isn't just with your ears. You've got to watch what someone's doing because they're communicating with your body and you're responding with your body. So you've got to listen with your whole body. And the second part, presence of mind. This is the opposite of the distraction part that made it so difficult to listen. And this is a really difficult skill. How do you like filter your brain and tone out everything else and give someone like 100% of your focus? You know, how does that make you feel if you can tell someone is just here to talk to me and they don't have an agenda with what this conversation is leading to? Or they don't have anything they're trying to get out of it. They're just here to listen to me, right? Feels pretty good, right? That's why we respect and like those people. So it's trying to like clear out your mind and focus on what they're saying and realizing that there's so much that's coming from them that they're communicating that you need to use your whole brain to understand it. Paraphrasing. Anyone know what that means? Daniel?
Like repeating what they said just as words.
Yes. Like we talked about earlier, when you're talking to someone, you could be on completely different levels. So paraphrasing is really important because you're basically checking with them. Oh, so this is what you mean. Or like, do I really understand what you're saying? Like, you rephrase what they're saying and give it back to them. It's like a tennis match. It's like someone serves you the ball, they said something, and you're like, wait a second, is this what you said? And you hit it back at them to make sure. So that's how you can kind of check that you're on the same plane and you both understand what you're saying. It also lets them know that you understand what they're communicating to you, because then you're showing them, oh, they really get what I'm saying. Now, asking questions is a pretty obvious one, but there's a couple ones I want to go through as far as like how to ask questions or what kind of questions to ask. Sometimes people ask questions that are completely unrelated, and that clearly shows that you aren't listening. So you want to make sure that you're asking the right questions. So for questions, one key type of question is an open-ended question. I know most of you have probably heard about this, but a closed-ended question is like a yes or no. There's like two choices, and they just pick one. An open question is like, how was that? How do you feel about that? What does that mean to you? They have no choice but to talk and elaborate because they don't have an easy answer. So it makes them talk and makes them share more. The second thing, other than open-ended questions, is probing questions. Probing is like probing down deeper. So it's kind of the idea that like, okay, they talked about this, tell me more. Kind of dig a little bit deeper before you move on to something else. Especially some people, you can tell they really need to talk about that. And sometimes it just helps to be like, okay, tell me more. How do you feel? They're very similar, but you know, an open-ended question can start the conversation to get them talking about any number of things. And once they get on the topic, then you want to dig deeper with the probing question. And the last thing is confirmations. So that's essentially paraphrasing. But the idea with confirmations is you're kind of confirming that, yes, we're on the same page. Yes, I get what you're saying and all that. So how do you know when you're listening? This is interesting. The first one is really deep. Shut up. Just don't talk as much. A lot of times we feel like we need to fill the air with conversation. And it's back to that self-importance where it's like, okay, I need to be talking. I need to be saying something. But really, if you just shut up, it helps. It's a really fun exercise. Try and like consciously think about how little you're talking. And be like, I'm going to talk to this person. I'm going to try as hard as I can not to talk. And the good questions is what keeps the conversation flowing. So if you're bad at it and you just sit there and stare at them, it doesn't work. But you got to get them talking about something they're passionate about. Because that's one of the things we did in our exercise is tell you to talk about things you're passionate about so you can just keep talking and talking and talking. Now remember is the second thing. So you're gauging how much did you remember from the conversation. I don't know if you've talked to someone and then they come back at you and be like, hey, remember when we talked about this? And you're like, huh? Like, yeah, we were sitting over there. Yeah, remember that? What? And you just totally forgot the entire conversation. Emma?
I don't know if you guys did, but like, do you ever like meet someone and you totally remember what you talked about, but you don't remember their name?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what most of I do, I think.
Yeah. So that's a good point. So what's one way that we can remember people's names when you're listening? Because obviously the hard thing about remembering someone's name, it's the first thing they say, and you're still thinking about, how am I going to talk to this person? What am I going to tell them? So when they say it, you weren't really listening, and that's not a bad thing. It's not natural to listen because you're trying to think of what to say. That's why it's so hard to remember names. So the biggest thing to do when remembering names, this is just a side point, but like, you know that paraphrasing? Like, oh, hi, your name was? And then they are like, what's your name, Thomas? And they're like, oh, my name's Thomas. And I'm like, hey, Thomas, well, my name's Peter. And you repeat their name like 3-4 times within the first like 2-3 sentences. It doesn't sound weird, I promise. But that'll help you remember it because you're saying it, you're acting it out, and you're repeating it, and you're using more of your mental energy on their name. And what I do personally is a lot of times as I'm talking to them, I'll be thinking that other 275 words that my brain can process is thinking about their name so that I remember it. So that's a good point. And it's the fact that like when we're first meeting someone, like I said, a good listener would be 100% focused on them, but you really need to be thinking about what you're going to say because you still don't have a relationship. So yeah, remembering, a lot of times it's fun to go back and see how much you can remember from a conversation. Like intentionally talk to someone and then try to like remember how much, or like after the conversation, go back and think through your head about how much you remembered. It's kind of fun sometimes, especially if you're meeting lots of people. And it's actually an exercise and a skill you can develop to where that you're really good with people's names. And you can remember all these different details about them because you're actually listening. So the other way to show is not to interrupt or change the subject. How annoying is it when you're trying to talk about something and someone changes the topic, right? You're like halfway through with your story and they like got distracted with their cell phone and then start talking about what the person texted them. And you're like, ugh, I was in the middle of my story. And it's frustrating, right? And clearly they weren't listening to you. So that's why we do these open-ended questions, probing questions, because like a probing question is the opposite of changing the topic question. Because you're like, okay, let's focus in on that. Let's go deeper. And that you're showing them that like, yes, I am interested in what you have to say. I'm not going to change this and focus on me again, change the topic. And then the last thing is to ask more from genuine curiosity. So this is something also that sometimes you might have to fake it till you make it, in the sense that, you know, if you're not necessarily super curious about what they're saying at first, you got to probe a couple questions, and generally they'll be talking about something pretty interesting. So who has a dog? Just think for a second about what you like about your dog. Like what's enjoyable about a dog. This is a really interesting quote about why dogs make great listeners and why they would make great people. Basically, this would be like from the dog's point of view. Here's why I'm a good person. Because I listen. I cannot speak, so I listen very well. I never interrupt. I never deflect the course of the conversation with a comment of my own. People, if you pay attention to them, change the direction of one another's conversations constantly. It's like having a passenger in your car, grab the steering wheel, and turn it to the side of the street. Because you're trying to focus on your conversation and they just pull it out of the way. So that's what it means to be a good listener. And I wanted to leave you guys some fun little tidbits of ways to apply it. First off, I know we've been talking about conversations, but imagine if you did these same things in class listening to your professor. You can't necessarily like ask a probing question all the time or, you know, show your body language, but Like what you're saying, Whitney, where like you're upright sitting, that helps you pay attention in class, right? And you can focus on what they're saying and listening to what the teacher says. How much more would you get out of a lecture if you were listening? But another thing is the phone stack game. This is applicable at social gatherings or like going out to eat with a bunch of friends. You just make a little stack of phones on the side of the table. Everyone puts their phone on it, and you can't touch it. And it's really fun to watch them all vibrate and try to guess who's getting all the texts. Who's the popular one? No, I'm just kidding. The other thing is to listen without an agenda. So 100% going to talk to someone purely to listen to what they have to say. You don't have an agenda. You're not there to get something out of the conversation. Just come listening without an agenda. So it's a fun thing to do. And just like find someone or a friend, and when you hang out, just make that conscious decision that, hey, I'm not going to have an agenda in this. And then the same thing, like start a conversation where your whole goal is to listen. Like seek someone out and be like, oh, I'm going to practice my listening. They'll love you for it. And you'll learn how to listen better. Or limit yourself to like a certain amount of questions, or like I'm only allowed to ask a question or rephrase what they said. I cannot add a statement to this. That's the only thing you're allowed to do in a conversation. So yeah, thanks you guys. I'll call back Liz and she'll talk about the group discussion.